She buried her husband with one hand and packed her only suitcase with the other because the town of Harlan Creek had already decided a fat, grieving widow of 20 had nothing left to offer the living. She didn't weep at the cattle drive camp when the cowboys laughed at her. She picked up the cast iron skillet, built the fire, and got to work. She wasn't there to be chosen. She was there to survive. But the trail boss was watching, and he hadn't looked away since she arrived. If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel, follow along until the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Nora Calloway buried her husband, the sky over Harlan Creek was the color of old bone. She was 20 years old. James had been 23. A fever took him in 4 days fast and merciless, the way the frontier took everything it wanted without asking permission. He was there on Monday, burning and shivering beneath a wool blanket, and by Friday, he was in the ground behind the Methodist church, underneath a wooden cross that the preacher had carved in under an hour, because James Calloway hadn't been important enough to warrant more time than that. Nora stood at the graveside alone. She had no family left in Harlan Creek. Her mother had died the winter before, and her father had disappeared into the Wyoming Territory years ago, chasing a rumor of silver that never materialized. James had been her family. James had been everything, and now he was gone. She pressed her palm flat against the wooden cross, just once, just for a moment, and then she turned around and walked back toward the house that was no longer hers, because the landlord was already on the porch when she got there. Mr. Cecil Pruitt. 60 years old, red-faced, a man who sweated through his collar even in February. He was waiting with his thumbs hooked into his suspenders and an expression on his face that suggested he had been rehearsing this conversation. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I'm real sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said. "The thing is," Pruitt continued, "the rent's been 2 weeks behind since James took sick, and I can't in good conscience let that run on any further." Nora stopped walking. She looked at him steadily. "My husband was buried this morning, Mr. Pruitt. I understand that, I do, but business is business. Mrs. Calloway and a widow woman with no income living alone in a 2-room house, well, that's a situation that don't resolve itself on its own." He cleared his throat. "I'll need you out by the end of the week." She didn't argue. She had learned early in her life that arguing with men like Cecil Pruitt cost more energy than it returned. "I'll be gone by Sunday," she said, and she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall for a long time. She was 20 years old. She was a widow. She had $4.60 in a tin box under the floorboard. And she was, according to every whispered conversation she had ever accidentally overheard in Harlan Creek, a woman whose prospects had never been particularly bright to begin with. Not because she lacked intelligence, not because she lacked courage or skill or warmth, but because Nora Calloway was a large woman. She had been large her whole life, big-boned and soft and round in a way that the women of Harlan Creek regarded with a mixture of pity and faint disgust, as though her body were an embarrassment she had chosen deliberately rather than simply been born into. She had a beautiful face, wide dark eyes, full lips, thick black hair that she kept pinned up in a knot at the back of her neck. People sometimes said, in the careful way people say things they mean as cruelty, but want to disguise as observation, "What a shame, really. She has such a pretty face," as though the face were a tragedy, as though the rest of her were the punishment. James had never made her feel that way. James had loved her exactly as she was, loudly and without qualification, which was one of the reasons the women of Harlan Creek had never fully trusted him. A man who loved a woman like Nora Calloway without apology was a man they couldn't quite categorize, and what they couldn't categorize, they distrusted. But James was gone now, and Nora had to figure out what came next. She heard about the cattle drive on Thursday morning, 2 days before she was supposed to leave the house. Old Pete Garfield mentioned it outside the general store. He wasn't talking to her, he was talking to another man, but Nora was right there beside the barrel of dried beans, and she heard every word. "Gideon Cole's running a drive up to Abilene," Pete said. "Leaving out of Miller's Crossing on Saturday. Got 30-some cowboys and no cook. His regular man broke his arm last week. Cole's been asking around. Who's going to cook for 30 cowboys for 6 weeks? The other man said. That's his problem. Pete laughed. Nora straightened up slowly. She was a good cook. She had been cooking since she was 9 years old, for her mother, then for herself, then for James, then for the 2 elderly neighbors she'd helped through last winter for a little extra money. She knew how to feed people. She knew how to make something out of almost nothing, how to stretch a pot of beans until it became a meal, how to bake bread over an open fire without burning it. She also had $4.60 and nowhere to go by Sunday. She walked directly to the address Pete had mentioned and knocked on the door. The man who opened it was thick-necked and sun-darkened, maybe 50 years old, with a gray mustache and impatient eyes. He looked at her, and she watched his face go through several rapid expressions: surprise, assessment, and then something that settled into reluctant skepticism. "I'm here about the cook position," Nora said, "for Cole's cattle drive." "You're the widow Calloway," the man said. "I am, Mrs. Calloway." He said it carefully. A cattle drive is hard work. 6 weeks on the trail, sun up to sundown, sometimes through rough country. It ain't. He paused, and she could see him choosing words. It ain't exactly suited to a woman my size, she said flatly. He blinked. He hadn't expected her to say it outright. I've been cooking since I was 9 years old, Nora continued. I can bake bread on an open fire. I can feed 30 men on short supply. I don't quit, I don't complain, and I don't need looking after. I need this job. So before you tell me no, I'd ask you to let me prove what I can do first. He studied her for a long moment. Then he said, You know anything about a chuck wagon? I can learn anything you show me once. Another pause, longer this time. Cole makes the final call, the man said. You'd have to talk to him. Then take me to him. Gideon Cole was not what she expected. She had heard the name before everyone in the territory had heard the name. Gideon Cole was 36 years old, a trail boss who had run cattle drives from Texas to Kansas for over a decade. A man with a reputation for being fair-minded and iron-willed, and completely immune to other people's opinions. He owned a ranch east of Harlan Creek, ran it lean and clean, and had never once, as far as anyone could tell, concerned himself with what the town thought of him. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair threaded through with early gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from creekstone. He had the kind of weathered handsomeness that comes from years of outdoor living, not prettiness, not youth, but something quieter and more settled, like a landscape you could trust. He was standing beside the corral checking a horse's foreleg when the thick-necked man, whose name turned out to be Hank, the drive's segundo, brought Nora over. Cole looked up. He looked at her the way she had learned to brace for the quick assessment top to bottom that most men performed without even realizing they were doing it. She kept her chin level. She had learned that, too. This is Mrs. Nora Calloway, Hank said. She's asking about the cook position. Cole straightened up. He was taller than she'd realized, a head taller than Hank, easy. He looked at Nora directly, not past her, not around her, just at her. Mrs. Calloway, he said. His voice was even and low. You ever cooked on a trail drive before? No, sir. But I've cooked for large numbers of people. I'm a fast learner, and I don't fold under pressure. It's 6 weeks, he said. Hard terrain, long days. The men aren't always easy to get along with. I'm not looking for easy, she said. I'm looking for work. He considered that. He was quiet in the way that some men were quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they took what they said seriously enough to think about it first. You got any references? He asked. The Mathers family on Birch Road, Mrs. Abbott on the east end of town, Reverend Stone at the Methodist Church. She paused. I also cooked for my husband until 4 days ago when I buried him. He never complained once. Something shifted in Gideon Cole's expression. Not pity, not awkwardness, but a kind of recognition she didn't expect, like she had said something he understood. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and he meant it. She could tell. "Thank you," she said. "I'm still standing, and I still need work." Cole was quiet again. He looked at her, really looked the way she wasn't used to being looked at. Not at her size, not at the evidence of grief still visible around her eyes, not at the dress that had been let out twice at the seams, just at her. Then he said, "Pay is $40 for the full drive, meals and board included. You leave with us Saturday morning and you stay until we reach Abilene. I need a full commitment." Nora's heart was beating hard. She kept her face still. "You have it," she said. Cole nodded once. "Be at Miller's Crossing by first light Saturday. Bring what you need for 6 weeks. Don't bring anything you're not willing to lose." He turned back to the horse. The conversation was over. Nora turned and walked away, and she didn't let herself breathe fully until she was half a block down the road, and then she breathed out slow and long and had to press her hand against a fence post for a moment to steady herself. $40. $40 and 6 weeks and somewhere to be. It wasn't much, but it was everything she had. She told no one she was leaving. There was no one to tell. She packed the same bag she had packed a dozen times in her imagination over the past hard years, 3 dresses, a shawl, her mother's Bible, the tin box with the $4.60, a small photograph of James that she wrapped carefully in cloth and placed at the very bottom where it wouldn't bend. She left the keys to the house on the kitchen table for Pruitt. She walked out without looking back. Miller's Crossing on Saturday morning was loud and dusty, and alive with the chaos of 30 cowboys assembling themselves and their horses and their equipment into something resembling organized movement. Cattle lowed in the holding pen. Horses stamped and shook their heads. Men called to each other in a half-dozen accents from Texas to Missouri. Nobody noticed Nora arrive. She found the chuck wagon easily enough. It was the only wagon not carrying cattle equipment, and climbed up to inspect what she was working with. The previous cook had left it in moderate disorder. She began sorting and organizing immediately, her mind already calculating what she had and what she'd need, how far the staples would stretch, what she could make for 30 men with a limited supply of flour and dried beans and salt pork. "That's the Fat Widow." She heard it clearly. 2 voices somewhere to the left of the wagon, young by the sound of them. "Cole's bringing a fat widow to cook on a cattle drive." A laugh, low and mean. "She's gonna slow us down just walking from the wagon to the fire. Boss must be desperate. Boss must be blind." Nora didn't stop what she was doing. She kept sorting, kept cataloging, kept her hands moving and her face neutral. She had been hearing versions of this conversation her entire life. She knew exactly how much energy it deserved. None. She would do her job. She would do it better than anyone expected. And she would not give those voices a single visible reaction to feed on. That was the only answer she had ever found that worked. The drive pulled out at first light. Gideon Cole rode at the front where a trail boss belonged. Nora had the chuck wagon, which meant she rode ahead of the herd to set up camp at the next stop before the cattle arrived. That suited her. She preferred being useful to being observed. The first day was long and hot and demanding, and she didn't complain once. She had camp set up and fire going, and coffee boiling before the first cowboys reached the evening stop. By the time the herd was settled, and the men came in hungry and tired, she had salt pork and beans and cornbread waiting enough for everyone piping hot. The cowboys ate without much conversation the first night. They were assessing her, she knew, waiting to see if she could really do this. She could. She refilled cups without being asked. She kept the fire steady. She noticed that one of the younger cowboys, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, was favoring his right hand, and she found a clean cloth and wrapped it without making a production of it. "Thank you, ma'am," the boy said quietly. "What's your name?" she asked. "Billy," he said. "You eat enough, Billy?" "Yes, ma'am." "Come back if you're still hungry. There's more." He looked at her with a kind of surprised gratitude, like kindness was something he hadn't entirely expected. She understood that look. She'd worn it herself once. Cole came to the chuck wagon after the men were settled. He didn't say much. He refilled his own coffee cup, stood for a moment, looking at the fire, and then looked at her. "Good meal tonight," he said. "Thank you." The men noticed. "I didn't cook it for them to notice," she said. "I cooked it because they were hungry." He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost invisible, but she caught it. "That boy Billy," he said. "The one with the hurt hand. You caught that fast." "It wasn't hard to see," she said. "No," Cole said. "It wasn't. But most people don't look." He finished his coffee. He set the cup down on the wagon step. "First light tomorrow," he said. "Sleep when you can." "Yes, sir." He started to walk away. Then he stopped. He turned back just slightly, not quite facing her. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Yes." He seemed to be deciding something. Then he said, "You did good today." And then he walked away into the dark. She stood there a moment, looking at the fire. 3 words. "You did good." She didn't know why those 3 words landed so differently from the polite acknowledgments she was used to. Maybe because he said them like he meant them, plain and undecorated. Maybe because he had looked directly at her when he said them, not at a point slightly past her ear, the way people did when they were performing courtesy, rather than expressing it. Maybe because nobody had said anything like that to her in a very long time. She began cleaning up the camp for the night. The stars over the Montana sky were impossibly dense, layer upon layer of them, and the herd was quiet now, and somewhere in the dark a coyote called once, and then was answered. She thought about James. She thought about the little house with the kitchen table where she had sat and stared at the wall. She thought about Cecil Pruitt, and his thumbs in his suspenders, and his face that had practiced its performance of sympathy. She thought about the 2 young cowboys and their low, mean laughter. And then she stopped thinking about any of it. She had work to do tomorrow. She always had work to do. That was the thing about survival. It kept giving you the next thing to do and the next until eventually you looked up and realized you were still standing, which was more than anyone had expected, including yourself. By the end of the first week, the cowboys had stopped laughing. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Not because she had confronted anyone or made any speeches. But because the food was consistently good, the camp was consistently ready when they arrived, and the small details, a wrapped hand, a remembered name, a cup refilled before it was asked for, had begun to accumulate into something the men found themselves counting on without quite realizing they'd started. Even the 2 voices she'd heard on the first morning, she'd figured out who they belonged to by the 3rd day, a pair named Darnell and Roy, loud and young, and performing their toughness for each other, had gone quiet on the subject of her. She noticed one evening that Darnell had started saying "Thank you, ma'am," when he took his plate. Small things. But she had learned to pay attention to small things. Small things were how the world actually moved underneath all the loud drama people performed on top of it. Cole, she noticed, paid attention to small things too. He was around the camp more than she would have expected from a trail boss. She had imagined him as more remote, more separate from the everyday operations of the drive. But he appeared at the edges of things, constantly checking on a limping horse, at dusk, settling a quiet dispute between 2 men before it could grow, making sure the night watch schedule was fair. He didn't announce himself. He just appeared where things needed attending to, dealt with them, and moved on. She saw him one evening crouching beside old Pete Garfield. He was on the drive, it turned out, had been riding with Cole for years, handing the older man something from his own saddlebag. Medicine, it looked like. Pete had been fighting a cough for 3 days. Cole hadn't mentioned it to anyone. He hadn't made anything of it. He'd just handled it. She stood watching from the chuck wagon and thought, that's a man who does what needs doing and doesn't need anyone to witness it. She understood that impulse entirely. It was, in fact, the principle by which she had run her entire life. The second week, something changed between them. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to in the moment. But one evening, Cole sat down near her fire after the men were settled and didn't leave right away. He refilled his coffee cup, and then he asked her in his quiet, direct way, "Where are you from originally, Mrs. Calloway, before Harlan Creek?" "Wyoming Territory," she said. "Small settlement. Not even a proper town." "What brought you east?" "My mother was sick. She wanted to come back closer to where she grew up. We moved when I was 13. She paused. "She died 2 years later anyway." "I'm sorry," he said. "It was a long time ago." She turned a log in the fire. "Where are you from?" He accepted the question, returning to him without deflecting. "Texas originally. Came north when I was young. Never went back." "Family." "A brother. We don't write much." He was quiet a moment. "My wife was from Kansas. She died 4 years ago." Nora looked up. He was looking at the fire. His face was composed the way faces got when grief had had enough time to settle into something manageable, but not gone. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a fever," he said. "Fast." She went still. "Mine too," she said quietly. 4 days. He looked at her then. And there was something in that look, not romance, not performance, but recognition. The particular recognition of two people who have survived the same specific variety of devastation and find themselves improbably in the same place at the same time. "How long ago?" he asked. 11 days, she said. Something moved across his face. 11 days, he repeated. "And you're here." "Had to be somewhere," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I reckon that's true." He finished his coffee. He set the cup down. "You're a strong woman, Mrs. Calloway," he said. Not as flattery, as simple observation. "I don't know if that's strength," she said honestly. "It might just be stubbornness." The corner of his mouth moved. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "In my experience," he said, "those two things are close enough to the same that it don't much matter." He said goodnight and walked away into the dark. She sat by the fire for a long time after he left. She was not a woman who had spent much of her life daydreaming about men. She had loved James genuinely and lost him genuinely, and she was not naive enough to think that kind of thing happened twice. She was a widow of 20, with a body the world had decided to regard as an inconvenience on a cattle drive in the middle of Montana, with $40 coming at the end of it if everything went right. She was not daydreaming, but she was noticing. She noticed that he said things directly instead of wrapping them in the careful cushioning most people used around her. She noticed that he looked at her when he spoke to her. She noticed that 11 days after she buried her husband, a man whose name she'd known from reputation and not much else had hired her without hesitation and told her she'd done good on the first day and sat at her fire and talked to her like she was a person worth talking to. These were not nothing. She didn't know what they were, but they were not nothing. By the third week, the drive had settled into its rhythms and Nora had settled into hers. She woke before anyone else. She had the fire going and the coffee hot before the first gray light touched the horizon. She cooked what she had and made it stretch and made it good. She learned the preferences of the men. Billy liked his beans with extra salt. Old Pete couldn't tolerate pepper. Darnell had a sweet tooth that she occasionally indulged with a pan of fried dough, drizzled with molasses when she had extra to spare. She remembered everyone's name. She remembered their stories. Roy, who talked tough and laughed mean, had a wife and infant son back in Texas and carried their photograph folded inside his vest pocket. She found that out because she'd noticed him checking it one evening when he thought no one was watching, and she'd asked him about it without making him feel observed. He'd shown her. The baby's name was Thomas. "He was born while I was on the last drive," Roy said quietly, without the bluster she'd come to associate with him. "I ain't met him yet." "You'll be home before the summer's out," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He folded the photograph carefully. "I know." She saw him differently after that. Not as the voice that had called her fat and slow and likely to be a problem. but as a young man carrying a photograph of a child he hadn't held yet, doing the only work he knew how to do. That was the thing about people in her experience. They were almost always more complicated up close. Cole was more complicated up close. She learned this gradually in the way you learned things about people who didn't offer them willingly, through observation, through small moments, through the occasional conversation that went a little longer than strictly necessary. He was precise. He kept his own equipment meticulous and expected the same of his men, not through harshness, but through clear expectation. He made decisions fast when he had to and held off when he didn't, and she noticed that he almost never had to reverse a decision he'd made. He was also underneath the competence and the authority and the stone-cut jawline, a person who had been lonely for a long time. She saw it in the way he sat at her fire in the evenings. He didn't have to sit there. He could have eaten with the men or alone at a distance the way some trail bosses did. He came to the chuck wagon. He came to the fire. He came to the conversation. She didn't analyze it too carefully. She had enough sense to know that analysis was a way of protecting yourself from things that were happening, and she wasn't sure yet whether she needed protecting. But she noticed, and she thought quietly that perhaps he noticed that she noticed, and neither of them said anything about it, because some things moved better in silence in the early stages. Some things needed time to become what they were going to be without the pressure of being named before they were ready. It was on a Tuesday afternoon somewhere in the third week that the first real trouble found the drive. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't the terrain. It was 3 men on horseback who came out of the east at a canter and positioned themselves across the trail ahead of the herd with the specific practiced ease of men who had done this before. Nora was ahead with the chuck wagon. She saw them first. She brought the horses to a stop and sat very still watching. The man in the middle was perhaps 45, dark-hatted, with a relaxed proprietary quality about him that she associated immediately with men who were accustomed to taking things. He had the look of someone who didn't expect to be refused. She had known men like that. She knew exactly what they wanted before he opened his mouth. She kept her hands visible and her face calm and watched Gideon Cole ride up from behind the herd to deal with it. "This is Hendricks Range," the man said. "Has been for 8 years. You're trespassing." "This is open territory," Cole said. His voice was completely level. "We have right of passage, same as always." "Not anymore. Mr. Hendricks has purchased this land. You'll need to go around." "Going around adds 4 days and 40 miles to this drive," Cole said. "There's no purchase recorded at the Territorial Land Office. I checked before we left." The man smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Records get updated," he said, "sometimes faster than news travels." Cole was quiet for a moment. Nora from the chuck wagon watched his back, watched the way he sat on his horse completely still, which was its own kind of message. "We're going through," Cole said. "If Hendricks has a legitimate claim, he can bring it to the territorial judge. In the meantime, I've got 30 cattle hands behind me and a legal drive permit in my coat pocket, and I'd recommend you get out of the road." The 3 men looked at each other. Then the spokesman moved his horse aside. "This isn't finished," he said. "That's between Hendricks and the law," Cole said. "Not between Hendricks and me." He rode back along the herd without hurrying. He passed the chuck wagon and he glanced at her as he went by. Their eyes met for a moment. She didn't say anything, neither did he. But she had seen something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not worry exactly. More like the careful, settled expression of a man who knew that what had just happened was not actually the end of something. It was the beginning, and they both understood it. She picked up the reins and moved the chuck wagon forward. There was supper to make. And whatever was coming, whatever Hendricks and his men intended next, whatever shape the trouble would take when it came back for them, she would be ready. She had survived harder things than 3 men on horseback who thought they owned the road. She had buried her husband 11 days before she got here. She was still standing. That was what she did. The trouble came back on a Wednesday. Not in the form of 3 men on horseback this time. It came in the form of a missing water source, Nora heard it from Billy first early morning before the camp had fully woken. He came to the chuck wagon with his hat in his hands and his face tight with something he was trying not to show. "Ma'am," he said, "Hank says the creek at the next stop is dry." She looked at him. "How dry?" "Dead dry. Like it's been diverted." He hesitated. "Hank thinks somebody did it on purpose." She was quiet for a moment, letting that settle. "How far to the next water after that?" "Half a day. Maybe more depending on the terrain." She did the math fast. 30 men, a herd of cattle midsummer heat. Half a day without water was manageable. A full day was dangerous. If there was more trouble ahead, if Hendrix's people had worked further along the route, it could become something much worse than dangerous. "Tell Hank I'll cut the morning coffee rations in half," she said. "Save what we can. And tell him to let Mr. Cole know." Billy nodded and went. She began reorganizing the water storage on the wagon with quiet efficiency, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the problem. She had learned a long time ago that panic was only useful if it produced action. If it didn't produce action, it was just noise. She was not interested in noise. Cole came to the wagon 20 minutes later. She saw the set of his shoulders before she saw his face, and she knew the situation had already gotten more complicated than Billy had let on. "Tell me," she said before he could open his mouth. He looked at her briefly, and something in his expression shifted the kind of shift that happened when someone surprised you by being exactly as direct as you needed them to be. "It's not just the creek," he said. "Hank rode ahead this morning. The bridge at Sutter's Crossing has been taken apart. Planks pulled up and hauled off. The cattle can ford the river but not with the wagon. We'd have to rebuild it or find another way across." "Hendrix," she said. "Has to be. Nobody else has a reason." He looked at her steadily. "It adds at least 2 days if we ford without the wagon. I can send the wagon south to the low crossing, but that means you're separated from the drive for a full day, maybe more, and you'd be traveling without escort." She absorbed that without flinching. "What's the alternative?" "We rebuild the bridge. I've got enough men, but it costs us time we can't really afford." "What does your gut say?" He looked at her for a moment, as though the question caught him slightly off guard. Not because it was inappropriate, because he wasn't used to being asked. "Rebuild," he said finally. "Going around leaves us vulnerable in a different way. If Hendrix's people are watching and they are splitting, the drive up is exactly what they want." "Then rebuild," she said. "I'll make the water stretch, and I'll keep the men fed while they work." He nodded once. Then he said, "You're not worried." "Of course I'm worried," she said. "But worried doesn't build a bridge." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, it doesn't." He went to organize the men. She went to figure out how to feed 30 cowboys on short water with what she had in the wagon. The answer, it turned out, involved a great deal of creativity and a sack of dried corn she'd been saving for an emergency. This counted. The bridge work took most of the day. The men were hot and short-tempered by noon, the way men got when they were doing hard physical labor in summer heat on reduced water rations. She kept coffee going, despite the conservation. Some things were more important than strict rationing, and morale was one of them. She made a cold corn mash that wasn't anyone's idea of a satisfying meal, but had enough substance to keep hands working and heads from going light. She carried water to the men at the bridge herself. She didn't ask anyone to do it for her. She filled the bucket, walked it down, refilled cups, walked it back. She did it 6 times over the course of the afternoon without making anything of it. Roy was the one who said something. He was hauling timber with 2 other men, shirt dark with sweat, and when she came down with the water bucket, he said, "Ma'am, you don't have to—" "Drink," she said, and held out the ladle. He drank. He looked at her over the rim of it. "Darnell said you're the best camp cook he's worked with," Roy said. "He didn't say it to you, but he said it." She kept her face neutral. "Darnell can say it to my cornbread. It'll appreciate the compliment." Roy laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him, not the performed kind. She took the bucket back up. She passed Cole on the way. He had been working alongside the men all day. She hadn't expected that either, but she was finding that the things she hadn't expected about Gideon Cole were accumulating at a rate that warranted attention. He stopped when she passed. He was breathing hard, forearms dark with creek mud. "How's the water holding?" he asked. "If we make the next source by tomorrow afternoon, we'll be fine," she said. "If we don't..." She left it there. He understood the rest. "We'll make it," he said. It wasn't bravado. It was just a statement of what he intended. She found she believed him. That surprised her, too. The bridge was done by late afternoon, rougher than the original, but solid enough for the wagon and the cattle. The herd crossed in the early evening, moving with the practiced ease of animals that had been handled well, and the chuck wagon followed without incident. They made camp on the far side of the river as the sun went down. Nora cooked the best meal she could manage, given what she had: salt pork and beans and biscuits, baked fast and hard over the fire, with the last of the molasses divided among the men in small portions. It wasn't much, but she put every bit of skill she had into making it as good as it could be, because she knew that food after a hard day was more than nutrition. It was a message. It was someone telling you that your work was seen, and it mattered. She knew that because nobody had told her that enough times in her life, and she remembered what the absence felt like. She would not let these men feel it if she could help it. They ate quietly. Tiredness had softened the usual noise of a camp full of men, the competing voices, the card games, the arguments about nothing that were really arguments about being 20 years old and far from home. Tonight was quieter. Tonight they just ate and breathed and let the river sound fill the space. Cole sat by the fire after the others moved off. He didn't say anything for a while. She worked around him, cleaning and organizing for the morning, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't require filling. Then he said, "You carried water to the bridge all afternoon." "Someone had to," she said. "That's not in your duties. Neither is wrapping Billy's hand or stretching the coffee rations or keeping Darnell from picking a fight with Roy last week when Roy ate his last biscuit." She set a clean pan back in its place. "I do what needs doing. That's what I'm here for." He looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask," she said. "The morning you came to hire on, you were 11 days out from burying your husband. You could have found work in town. Something easier. Something..." He paused, choosing words with the care she had come to recognize as characteristic of him. "Something that didn't require you to get on a wagon with 30 strangers and drive cattle through the Montana summer." "I could have," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. She owed him honesty. He had given her honesty consistently. She could return it. "Because I needed to go somewhere that wasn't Harlan Creek," she said. "Somewhere where nobody knew me. Where I wasn't the widow, or the fat girl, or the woman people felt sorry for in the way they feel sorry for things they also find faintly embarrassing." She kept her eyes on the fire. "I needed to be somewhere I could just be what I could do. And I thought if I can prove that on a cattle drive, I can prove it anywhere." Silence. She looked up. Cole was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not pity. Not sympathy exactly. Something deeper than that. The recognition again, the one that had surfaced the night they talked about their dead spouses, but broader, now more open. "I understand that," he said quietly. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I told you." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The fire cracked and settled between them. "Good night, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Good night, Mr. Cole." He stood and walked away into the dark. She put her hand on the wagon step and stood there a moment looking at the fire and not thinking about anything in particular, which was a way of thinking about everything at once without having to be responsible for it. Then she went to sleep. She had work in the morning. She always had work in the morning. 3 days later, the second twist found them. It came in the form of a rider arriving at dawn camp, a young man on a lathered horse who asked for Cole by name and handed him a folded letter without preamble. Nora was 20 feet away at the chuck wagon. She saw Cole open the letter and read it and go very still. That stillness told her more than the letter could have. She waited until the rider had been given water and food and sent to rest, and then she kept working and let Cole have whatever time he needed with whatever the letter contained, because she had learned that men like Gideon Cole came to things on their own schedule, and waiting was almost always more productive than pressing. He came to her an hour later. "The Territorial Land Office in Helena," he said. "Someone filed a claim on the route we're using. Not Hendricks, someone acting as Hendricks's agent. The claim is fraudulent, Hank thinks, but it's been recorded, and it's going to take time to dispute through proper channels." He folded the letter back up. "Meaning we can't use the main trail from here forward without risking a confrontation that I can't predict and can't afford." "What's the alternative route?" she asked. "There is one. It's harder terrain, longer, probably adds a week to the drive." He looked at her directly. "It also takes us through country that's been dry this summer. Water could be a problem." She thought about that. A week longer, harder terrain, water uncertainty. "And if we push through on the main trail anyway?" she asked. "Hendricks has men positioned. The rider confirmed it. They're not just going to harass us this time." He paused. "They're armed, and they've been told to stop the drive." The weight of that sat between them for a moment. "So it's not really a choice," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." "Then tell me what you need from me for a week longer on the trail." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite gratitude, but was in the same family as it, the look of a man who had been braced for difficulty and found steadiness instead. "I need you to keep the men fed and their spirits from going under," he said. "I need what you've been doing just for longer." "I can do that," she said. "I know you can," he said. 3 words again, different ones this time, same weight. She turned back to the wagon and started planning for a week of harder country. The new route was exactly as difficult as Cole had said it would be. The terrain was uneven and demanding the kind of land that punished inattention and rewarded only those who kept their focus entirely on what was directly in front of them. The herd moved more slowly. The men were tired in a bone-level way by the end of each day, the kind of tired that didn't fully resolve with sleep. Nora cooked bigger when she could, and smaller when she had to, and made each meal as good as the supplies allowed. She stayed ahead of the herd with the chuck wagon, and she learned to read the country as she moved through it, not just the visible geography, but what it implied. Where the animals gathered told her where water might be. The way the grass lay told her which direction the wind had been coming from and for how long. She began finding water sources the men hadn't identified. The first time she pulled the wagon up near a dry-looking rise and told Billy, who was riding alongside her that morning. "There's water under that ground, 50 yards east of that rock formation. Tell someone to dig." He looked at her. "Ma'am?" "The grass is greener in a strip running east from that rock. Something's feeding it. Dig." He looked skeptical, but he told Hank. Hank dug. They hit water at 4 feet. Not a river, not a spring, just a shallow seep enough to fill the barrels and water the horses and give the men what they needed. After that, Billy stopped looking skeptical. After that, the men started calling her Mrs. Nora. Not Mrs. Calloway, which was formal, or the cook, which was dismissive. Mrs. Nora, which was somewhere between respect and affection, which was exactly where she had always hoped someone might put her. Cole heard about the water. Of course he did. He came to the wagon that evening with the same quiet he always brought to her fire, and he sat down and he said, "How did you know?" "My father," she said, "before he left for Wyoming. He was a prospector. Not a good one. He never found what he was looking for, but he knew how to read land for water. He taught me before I was old enough to understand what I was learning." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Your father taught you to find water, and then left," he said. "Yes, that's a particular kind of cruelty." She hadn't expected him to name it like that. People usually softened it. He left to find opportunity. He had his reasons. These things happen. They didn't usually say, That's a particular kind of cruelty. Yes, she said again. It is. I'm sorry, he said. The same way he'd said it when she told him about James, like the words meant something coming out of him, not just social reflex. Don't be, she said. He gave me something useful before he went. That's more than some people get. Cole looked at the fire. You have a way, he said slowly, of finding what's worth keeping in the things that hurt you. She thought about that. I don't know if that's wisdom, she said. It might just be stubbornness again. The corner of his mouth moved. You said that before, he said, about stubbornness and strength. And you said they were close enough to the same thing. I meant it, he said. The fire cracked. The cattle were quiet. Somewhere behind them a man was playing a mouth harp badly the same 3 notes over and over, which should have been annoying, but somehow wasn't. Mr. Cole, she said. Gideon, he said, like it was something he'd decided. She paused. Gideon, she said. Something in his face settled not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But she was paying close attention. She always was. What happened to your wife? She asked. Quietly. Not intrusively. The way you asked something you actually wanted to know, not something you asked to fill silence. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, Her name was Catherine. She was 28. We'd been married 4 years. A pause. She was funny. That's what I think about most. People remember pretty women for being pretty, but Catherine, she made me laugh in a way I didn't know I was capable of. I'm not a man who laughs easy. No, Nora said. I noticed. The corner of his mouth again, deeper this time. She got sick in November, he said. Fever came on fast. Doctor rode out from town, said there wasn't much to be done. Another pause. I sat with her through it. Every night. She told me not to told me I was making a fuss, and I told her that was unfortunate because I was going to make the fuss anyway. He stopped. She was gone by the 2nd week of December. Nora didn't say, I'm sorry again. He didn't need it said again. She just sat with him, in the quiet of it. The ranch went cold after that, he said. Not temperature, just the particular warmth a place has when someone who loves it is living in it. That went. He looked at the fire. I've been running drives mostly. It's easier to be moving. Yes, she said softly. It is. He looked at her. You understand that. I took this job 11 days after James died, she said. I think I understand it pretty well. Something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but something shifted. She could feel it, and she thought he could too, and neither of them named it, because naming it would have required deciding what to do about it, and neither of them was ready for that. They sat by the fire a while longer. The mouth harp player gave up on his 3 notes. The night settled in around them, vast and dark, and full of stars, and the cattle breathed slow in the dark, and somewhere a horse shifted its weight and blew out through its nose, and the world felt for a moment like it could be survived. Not solved, not fixed, but survived. The next morning brought the worst crisis yet. Nora was loading the wagon before first light when Hank came to her moving fast, which Hank never did. The supply box is gone, he said. She stopped. Which supply box? The main one, grain, salt, the last of the flour. His voice was controlled but tight. Someone cut it loose from the wagon overnight. She put down what she was holding. Cut, she said. Not came loose. Rope was cut clean, he said. Blade. She stood still for 3 seconds. Then she said, Who was on watch last night? Darnell and a man named Cutter. Both swear they didn't see anything. Were they watching the wagon or watching the herd? Hank's jaw tightened. The herd. Get Cole, she said. Cole was there in 4 minutes. She could tell from the way he walked that Hank had already given him the outline, and he'd used those 4 minutes to think, because he arrived not in the place of processing news, but in the place of making decisions. "What do we have left?" he asked her without preamble. She had already been through it in her head. "Enough grain for 2 days if I cut rations hard. No flour. Salt's almost gone. We have dried beans, some salt pork cornmeal." She looked at him. "I can feed 30 men for 4 days if I'm ruthless about it. After that—" "The next supply town is 3 days out on the alternative route," Cole said. 4 if the terrain slows us." 4 days without flour or grain," she said. "Men are already tired. They need calories." "I know." "Can we hunt?" "Hank's a good shot, 2 or 3 of the others." He nodded. "We can try." "Then we hunt and I stretch what we have," she said. "And we move faster." "Moving faster with a tired herd risks—" "I know what it risks," she said. "But hungry men make mistakes. Tired men can push if they're fed. Hungry men can't." Cole looked at her. She looked back at him. "All right," he said. "We push." The next 4 days were the hardest of the drive. Nora made things out of almost nothing with a consistency that she could only maintain by refusing to think too far ahead. Each meal was its own problem with its own solution. She didn't let herself look at the dwindling supplies. As a whole, she looked at what she had right now and what she could make from it, and then she made it. Hank shot a deer on the second day. It was barely enough for 30 men, but she stretched it with beans and made a stew that was more substantial than it had any right to be, and the men ate it with the focused silence of people who understood they were being kept going by someone working very hard on their behalf. Roy said on the 3rd morning, "Mrs. Nora, what do you need to make this work?" She looked at him. He was exhausted, shadowed under his eyes, still carrying that photograph of his infant son in his vest pocket. "I need you to keep going," she said. "That's all I need from you." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he did. Cole moved among the men differently during those 4 days, less at a distance, more present. She noticed he was the last one to eat at each meal, always after he'd checked that every man had enough. She noticed he pushed the pace without making it feel like pressure. He had a way of moving that made the men want to match him rather than resent being pushed. She noticed a lot of things about him in those 4 hard days. She noticed that he trusted her judgment without asking her to explain it. She noticed that he came to her fire each night, no matter how late, no matter how tired. She noticed that he said her name, her first name Nora, which she had told him in one of their evening conversations, without quite realizing she was offering it with a particular quality she couldn't find a clean word for. Not tenderness exactly, not performance, something more fundamental. Like it mattered to him, like she mattered. And she was old enough and had been through enough to know the difference between a man who made you feel like you mattered because it cost him nothing, and a man who made you feel that way because it was actually true. On the 4th night, the night before they reached the supply town, she sat by the dying fire after the men were asleep, and she let herself feel for the first time in weeks the whole accumulated weight of everything. James in the ground behind the Methodist church, the house with the keys on the table, the tin box with $4.60, the voices that had said fat and slow and liability, the road that had been closed on purpose, the bridge that had been torn apart, the supplies that had been cut loose in the night. She let herself feel all of it, and it was heavier than she had allowed herself to admit while the work was happening. And she sat with it, and breathed through it, and did not cry, not because she was too strong for tears, but because she had cried all the tears she had available for the moment somewhere back in Harlan Creek, and the next ones hadn't come in yet. She heard boots on the ground behind her. Cole sat down beside her, not across the fire, beside her. 3 feet away, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of another person after weeks of existing in her own careful solitude. He didn't say anything, neither did she. They sat in the silence for a while looking at the dying fire. Then he said quietly, 4 more days, and we're through the worst of it. "I know," she said. You held this drive together, he said. These past days. The men know it. I know it. The men held the drive together, she said. I just kept them fed. Nora. Her name in that tone with that weight. Don't do that. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the full attention he usually directed outward at the terrain, at the herd, at the problem in front of him. He had turned it fully toward her, and it was a little like standing in a beam of light you hadn't expected. Don't minimize what you did, he said. You found water when we didn't have any. You fed 30 men on supplies that should have run out a day and a half ago. You kept the camp steady when any other person would have had a right to fall apart. He paused. I hired you because I was desperate, and you were convincing. But that's not why I'm glad you're here. Her heart was doing something she didn't have instructions for. Why are you glad I'm here? She asked. Her voice was steadier than she expected. He was quiet for a moment. Because you remind me, he said slowly, what it looks like when a person does what needs doing without waiting to be told they're allowed to. She absorbed that. Catherine did that, she said quietly. Yes, he said. She did. A beat. Then, James too, I reckon. Yes, she said. He did. They sat with that, with the people they had loved and lost sitting between them, not as obstacles, but as something more like witnesses. Two people who had buried what they loved and kept walking. I don't know what comes next, Nora said. Not fishing for anything, just saying what was true. After Abilene, I have $40 and no particular place to be. That's not nothing, Cole said. It's not everything either. No, he said. It's not. He didn't offer anything more than that. She didn't ask for it. But she felt sitting beside him, with the fire going to coals and the stars doing what stars did over Montana in the middle of summer, that the $40 and no particular place to be were not quite as desolate as they had seemed 11 days ago in Harlan Creek. That was not nothing either. She let herself have it, just that small, careful thing, without pushing it further than it was ready to go. The fire went out. They sat a little longer. Then she said goodnight and went to sleep, and for the first time since James died, she slept without dreaming of the things she had lost. She dreamed instead of the road ahead, rough and uncertain, and lit at the edges by something that might have been dawn, or might have been something else entirely. She didn't know which, but she intended to find out. They reached the supply town of Caldwell Station the next afternoon. It was not much of a town. A general store, a livery, a saloon, a handful of buildings that looked like they hadn't decided yet whether they were permanent or temporary. But it had flour and salt and grain, and that was what mattered. And Nora walked into that general store with the list she'd been composing in her head for 4 days, and she did not waste a single minute being relieved. Relief was for later. Supplies were for now. The storekeeper was a round man named Garvey, who looked at her list and then looked at her and said, "That's a considerable order." "I have 30 men to feed," she said, "and I've been doing it on almost nothing for 4 days. So yes, it's a considerable order." He filled it without further comment. She spent the afternoon restocking and reorganizing the chuck wagon with the focused intensity of someone who had learned recently and firsthand exactly what it felt like to run out. She was not going to run out again. She built redundancy into every category: flour, salt, cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, double what she thought she'd need, because she now understood that this drive was not a normal drive, and whatever Hendricks intended had not finished coming for them. Cole found her at the wagon near sunset. "Hank talked to some men at the saloon," he said. "Hendricks has filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office. Says we're trespassing on claimed land." Nora kept stacking flour sacks. "Is the claim real?" "No, but it's going to take the marshal time to verify that, and in the meantime, Hendricks is using it as cover." Cole's voice was even. "He's got 8 men positioned a day's ride ahead, not just blocking the trail this time, armed and with a paper that looks official enough to cause problems." She stopped stacking. She turned to look at him. "He's going to try to stop the drive by force," she said. He's going to try to make it look legal while he does it, Cole said. Which is worse? Can you go around them? Not without adding 10 days and going through country we don't have water for, even with the new supplies. He looked at her steadily. There's a third option. She waited. There's a man in Caldwell Station. Territorial land agent, he's here doing survey work. If we can get him to verify the route tonight and put his signature on a counter document, Hendrix's paper becomes worthless and his men have no legal standing. Then go get him, she said. He won't see me. I tried an hour ago. He's a political man and Hendrix has money, and Hendrix's name carries weight in this territory. He told me to come back through official channels. Cole's jaw tightened, which means 2 weeks minimum. Nora was quiet for a moment. What does he want? She asked. Men like that always want something. His wife is sick, Cole said. Traveling with him. Fever came on 2 days ago and the nearest doctor is a day's ride. He's frightened, and he's taking it out on everyone around him. Nora looked at him. He looked back at her. I'm not a doctor, she said. I know, he said. But you're the best I've got. The land agent's name was Whitmore. His wife's name was Helen. Helen Whitmore was 34 years old, and she was frightened in the particular way of someone who was trying very hard not to show it, which Nora recognized immediately because she had worn that expression herself for most of her adult life. The fever had been building for 2 days, not the violent sudden kind, but the slow creeping kind that could go either way and gave you enough time to worry about which way it would go. Nora sat beside her and took stock quickly and quietly. The fever was real, but not yet dangerous. What was dangerous was the dehydration. The woman hadn't been keeping water down, and without water, the fever would climb. When did you last keep anything down? Nora asked her. Yesterday morning, Helen said. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were clear, which was a good sign. Plain water makes it worse when your stomach is this unsettled, Nora said. I'm going to make you something. It's not going to taste good, but it'll stay down and it'll bring the fever down with it. Helen looked at her. Are you a nurse? No, ma'am, I'm a cook. But I've nursed 3 people through fever. My mother, my husband, and a ranch hand 2 winters ago. She paused. 2 of those 3 made it. Helen was quiet for a moment. Which 2? She asked. My mother and the ranch hand, Nora said honestly. Helen closed her eyes. Then she said, All right. Nora went back to the chuck wagon and made a broth from the bones she'd been saving, thin and heavily salted, and cut with a little vinegar and something she'd picked up in the general store that afternoon. On instinct, dried willow bark, which her mother had used for fever, and which she'd been grateful to see on Garvey's shelf. She steeped it in the broth, strained it, and brought it back in a tin cup. Helen Whitmore kept it down. By 10 o'clock, her fever had dropped enough that the tight, frightened look around Whitmore's eyes had loosened. By midnight, she was asleep. Whitmore sat across from Nora in the dim room and looked at his hands for a long time. She's been my wife for 12 years, he said. I know, Nora said. I should have. He stopped. I should have stopped the survey work when she first felt unwell. She told me she was fine, but I knew. He looked up. I knew, and I let the work come first. She's going to be all right, Nora said. You can't know that. No, she said. But the fever's coming down, and she's keeping fluid down, and she's sleeping clean. Those are good signs. Not guarantees, but good signs. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you want? He said, not unkindly, just directly. Mr. Cole sent you. What does he need? He needs you to look at the territorial route documentation and sign a counter-filing, she said. The claim against the drive is fraudulent. You know this territory. You can verify it tonight if you're willing. Whitmore was quiet. Hendrix is a powerful man, he said. Powerful men file fraudulent claims when they think nobody will call them on it, Nora said. You're the only person in a position to call him on it tonight. Another pause. If I sign that document, Whitmore said slowly, Hendrix will make my life difficult. If you don't, Nora said, A man running a legal cattle drive is going to be stopped by force in the morning. He'll lose the drive. His men will lose their wages, and Hendricks will know that filing a false claim works. She kept her voice even. I understand it costs you something. I'm asking you to decide if it's worth paying. Whitmore looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then he stood up. Get me the documentation, he said. No. Cole had the paperwork in front of Whitmore within 10 minutes. Nora waited outside while the two men worked through it. She had done what she could do, and the rest was between them and the law. She sat on the step and breathed the night air and thought about Helen Whitmore, asleep inside, with her fever dropping, and thought about James the way she always thought about James when she sat with someone sick, the helpless vigil of it, the way time moved differently in a sick room. She thought about Cole saying, "You remind me what it looks like when a person does what needs doing without waiting to be told they're allowed to." She wondered what James would have thought of Gideon Cole. She thought he would have liked him. James had always liked people who meant what they said. The door opened behind her, and Cole came out. He signed it, he said. She let out a long breath. The filing goes to the marshal's office in the morning, Cole continued. Whitmore's sending a rider tonight. By the time we reach Hendricks' men tomorrow, they'll have received word. He paused. It won't necessarily stop them on the spot, but it gives us legal standing to push through, and it takes the ground out from under Hendricks. What if they don't care about legal standing? Nora asked. Cole looked at her. Then we deal with that when it comes, he said. She nodded. That was the only honest answer. He sat down beside her on the step, closed the way he had sat beside her at the dying fire 4 nights ago. She had stopped being surprised by it. She had started quietly and without acknowledgement, counting on it. How'd you get him to sign? Cole asked. I took care of his wife, she said. And then I told him the truth. Just like that. Most people respond to the truth, she said. They just don't get it offered to them very often. Cole was quiet. Then, you could have asked him for anything tonight. He would have given it. I know, she said. I asked him for what we needed. He looked at her profile for a moment. She could feel it, that full, direct attention. Nora, he said. Something in his tone made her turn to look at him. His face was open in a way she hadn't seen before. Not vulnerable exactly. Cole was not a man built for vulnerability, the same way certain landscapes weren't built for it. But open, like a door that had been closed a long time and someone had decided finally to try the handle. I want you to know something, he said. Before tomorrow, before whatever happens with Hendricks' men. Her heart was moving in a way she was trying not to pay too much attention to. All right, she said. When I hired you in Harlan Creek, he said, I hired you because you stood in front of me and said you'd work harder than anyone I'd ever hired, and I believed you. That was all it was. He paused. It isn't all it is anymore. She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and direct, the way he did everything. I'm not going to say more than that tonight, he said. It wouldn't be right with tomorrow what it is, but I wanted you to know. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said softly. Yeah. Yes, she said. I've known for a while. Something shifted in his face, that almost smile deeper than usual. Stubborn, he said. You said it was the same as strong, she reminded him. I meant it then too, he said. They sat on the step a while longer. The night was warm and full of cricket sound, and somewhere in the saloon a man was playing a piano badly, which was different from the mouth harp, but similarly imperfect and somehow similarly fine. Then Cole stood up. First light, he said. I'll have coffee ready, she said. He looked at her one more moment. Then he walked away into the dark, and she sat there with the warm night and the bad piano and the fact of tomorrow arranged in front of her, like cards she hadn't turned over yet. She wasn't afraid. She found to her own mild surprise that she wasn't afraid at all. Hendricks' men were exactly where Cole had said they'd be. 8 riders positioned across the trail at a narrows where the land pressed in on both sides and there was no easy way around. They had a wagon across the road, and their hands were visible on their weapons, and the man in front, not the same spokesman as before, someone new, harder-faced, the kind of man hired specifically for moments like this one, held up a paper when Cole rode forward. "Trail's closed," the man said. "Legal order. Turn your herd around." Cole didn't take the paper. He looked at the man over it. "Territorial Land Agent Whitmore filed a counter-document with the marshal's office last night," Cole said. His voice carried back to where Nora sat on the chuck wagon, clear and level. "The claim you're holding is fraudulent. You have no legal standing here." The man's expression didn't change. "That's not what this paper says." "That paper was filed on false information," Cole said. "The verification went out before midnight. You can check with your employer before you do something you can't take back, or you can take my word for it. But either way, this drive is going through." 30 men against 8, the spokesman said. "You willing to make that bet?" "I'm willing to make it," Cole said. "Are you?" Silence. 30 cowboys behind Cole, quiet and still. Not performing, just present. The kind of weight that came from men who had been through 4 hard weeks together and had something to protect. Nora watched the spokesman's eyes move across the line of riders. She watched him do the math. She watched him decide. "This isn't over," the man said. "Between Hendricks and the law," Cole said. "Not between Hendricks and me." The exact same words he'd used 3 weeks ago at the first confrontation. She noticed. She thought he'd chosen them deliberately. The men moved the wagon. The drive went through. Nora released a breath she hadn't fully realized she was holding, and she clicked the horses forward, and the chuck wagon rolled through the narrows with the solid, unhurried weight of something that had decided it was going through and had simply done so. Billy rode up alongside her as they came through. "That was something," he said. "Yes?" she agreed. "You weren't scared." She glanced at him. "Of course I was scared," she said. "But scared doesn't stop a wagon." He thought about that for a moment. "No, ma'am," he said. "I reckon it doesn't." They were 2 days out of Abilene when the real catastrophe found them. Not Hendricks this time. Not blocked roads or cut supplies or fraudulent legal claims. Nature. The storm came up fast from the southwest on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky going from clear to the particular sick yellow-green color that old-timers read as serious in under an hour. The wind hit before the rain did, a hard driving wind that spooked the herd before anyone was ready for it. Nora was with the chuck wagon when she felt the pressure drop. She knew that feeling. Her mother had taught her that feeling. She pulled the horses to a stop and looked at the sky and thought, "This is bad." Then the lightning hit, not close, not yet, but close enough that the cattle felt it in the air. She heard the herd behind her change, the deep animal sound of 300 cattle going from settled to frightened in the span of a single breath, and she knew before anyone shouted it what was happening. The herd was going to run. She got the chuck wagon off the trail and onto the highest ground she could find, fast, tying the horses to a rock formation and pulling their blinders on, talking to them low and steady, the way you talked to frightened animals, using the calm you didn't actually feel because they needed it more than you did. Then she turned to see what was happening behind her. It was bad. The cattle were moving, not a full stampede yet, not the flat-out blind terror that meant death for anything in the path of it, but the agitated crowding surge that preceded a stampede, the way a gathering wave preceded a crash. The cowboys were riding hard to contain it, working the edges, pushing back against the pressure, and most of them knew what they were doing. But the lightning was still coming. And Cole was at the far edge of the herd on the side nearest the storm, which was where you needed to be to push the cattle away from it, and which was also the worst possible place to be when the storm came in close. She watched him work. He was riding Ranger, his dark horse, who was steady in ways that most horses weren't. Cole had trained him personally, and the result was an animal that could be trusted in chaos. Cole moved along the edge of the herd with the contained, deliberate energy of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and was doing it at the limit of what was safe. The next lightning strike was close, too close. Ranger went sideways, not a full bolt. The horse was too well trained for that, but a hard, violent sideways lurch that Cole almost stayed on top of, and almost wasn't enough. Almost. He went down. She saw it from 200 yards. She saw him fall, and she saw Ranger pull away spooked badly now, and she saw Cole on the ground in the path of the agitated herd, and she felt something happen in her chest that wasn't fear exactly, but was what fear became when it had nowhere left to go. She was moving before she'd consciously decided to move. She didn't run directly at the herd. She had enough sense for that running directly at 300 panicked cattle was not survival. It was sacrifice, and she wasn't here to sacrifice herself. She ran parallel along the edge, the way she had watched Cole work, calculating the angle, calculating where the herd's pressure was moving and where it wasn't looking for the seam. There was always a seam. Her father had told her that once about water, there's always a seam, a place where it moves differently than the bulk of it. The same was true of cattle. She had been watching herds move for 5 weeks, and she had learned the way Cole had learned through observation and attention, and she found the seam, and she moved through it. She reached Cole. He was conscious she could see that immediately, but his right leg was wrong, the angle of it wrong, and he was trying to get up and not making it. And around them, the herd was pressing the noise of it, enormous, the ground shaking with the accumulated weight of frightened animals. "Stay down," she said. "Nora, stay down." She crouched beside him, making herself as small and still as possible, and she put her hand on his arm and she said, "Look at me, right here. Don't look at the herd." He looked at her. "The leg," she said. "Right ankle," he said. His voice was controlled but tight with pain. "Hit the ground wrong. Broken. Don't know. Can you move it?" He tried. His jaw clamped down. "Somewhat." "Not broken then," she said. "Probably. We're going to move when I say move, not before. The herd is moving north," she said. "The seam we're in is moving south relative to the bulk of them. When the gap opens in about 30 seconds, we go left. Hard and fast." He looked at her. "You've been watching them," he said. Not a question. "For 5 weeks," she said. "I've had nothing else to do while I drive." The gap opened. "Now," she said. She got her shoulder under his arm, and she moved, and he moved with her. And she was a large woman with a lifetime of physical work behind her, and she used every pound and every year of it to pull them both through that gap before it closed. They cleared the edge of the herd. She got him down behind a rock formation, and they both stayed very still while the cattle pushed past and the cowboys rode hard, and the storm let loose its rain in a solid wall of water that soaked them both to the skin in under a minute. Cole was breathing hard. She was breathing hard. The rain came down. The herd kept moving. She kept her hand on his arm, and she didn't let go. "Nora," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't say anything yet. Just breathe." He breathed. She breathed. The herd moved north, and the cowboys moved with it, and gradually over the course of the next several minutes, the sound of it began to diminish, and the immediate crisis began its slow retreat from imminent to past. She sat back on her heels. She looked at him. He looked at her, rain running down his face, jaw still tight with pain, eyes completely steady. "You came through the herd," he said. "There was a seam," she said. "You could have been killed." "So could you." He stared at her. "That is not an equivalent situation," he said. "From where I'm sitting it is," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The rain began to ease, the storm moving northeast, taking its violence somewhere else. "Your dress?" he said. She looked down. The hem was badly torn from the run, and there was blood on her arm from somewhere she hadn't noticed. She looked at it with mild interest, the way you looked at damage to yourself after the emergency was past. "It's nothing," she said. It's nothing," she said again more gently. "Look at me. Are you all right?" He looked at her, and what was in his face then was not what she'd been braced for. It wasn't gratitude exactly, and it wasn't the familiar expression of someone surprised that she had managed something physically demanding. It was something rawer than either of those things. Something she recognized from the night at the dying fire, from the step outside Whitmore's room, from all the conversations that had built themselves quietly between them over 5 weeks of hard country. Something that had stopped being theoretical. "You're the most remarkable woman I've ever met," he said, quietly. Not as a compliment, as a statement of fact, the way he said everything. Her chest ached. "You need to stop talking," she said, "and let me look at that ankle." Nora. Gideon. She met his eyes. "Let me take care of you. Please." He stopped talking. She looked at the ankle. It was swelling already, not broken, she thought, but badly sprained enough that he wasn't going to be riding today, and probably not tomorrow. She unlaced the boot, carefully, feeling along the bones the way her mother had taught her, and she talked while she worked. Not about anything important, just steady words to give his attention somewhere to go that wasn't the pain. She told him about the water seep in the 3rd week, how her father had explained the logic of it once on a creek bank in Wyoming when she was 6 years old, and he was still there, and the world was still small and comprehensible. She told him how she had memorized it without knowing why, the way children memorized things before they understood their own reasons. "He gave me useful things," she said, before he went. "Yes," Cole said. His voice was softer with pain, but his eyes were on her face fully the way they always were. "I used to think about that, whether it canceled out the leaving." "Does it?" "No," she said. "But it doesn't get canceled out by it either. Both things are true." She sat back. "You're going to need to stay off this for at least a day. Hank can run the drive." "Hank can run the drive," Cole agreed. He paused. "Nora." "Yes. When we get to Abilene," he said carefully, like a man laying out words in an order he'd been thinking about, "I'd like to talk to you about what comes next." Her hands went still. "For you," he said. "What comes after the $40? She looked at him. "You said you had no particular place to be," he said. "I said that," she agreed. "I have a ranch," he said, "east of Harlan Creek, which I know is not exactly a selling point given your history with that town." "It's not the town I'd be going back to," she said carefully. "No," he said. "It wouldn't be." She absorbed that. Her heart was doing something complicated and important. "That's a very large conversation," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for an answer here, in the rain, with my ankle the size of a melon." The corner of his mouth moved deeper than usual, the closest thing to a full smile she'd seen from him. "I'm asking you to have it. In Abilene, when we get there." She looked at him for a long moment. The storm was gone. The sun was coming back low and gold the way it came after rain in summer, washed clean and almost unbearably bright. "All right," she said. "In Abilene." "In Abilene," he said. She stood up. She looked out at where the cowboys were getting the herd back under control, the patient practiced work of settling frightened animals, and she thought about a ranch east of Harlan Creek, and a man who said her name like it mattered, and had looked at her from the very first morning like she was a person worth looking at. Then Billy rode up fast, pulling his horse to a stop. "Mrs. Nora," he said. "You all right? We saw we didn't know." He was breathing hard, his young face tight with something she realized was genuine fear. For her. "I'm fine, Billy," she said. "You went through the herd," he said. "There was a seam," she said. He stared at her. Then he looked at Cole on the ground behind her, and back at her, and something settled in his face. Not just relief, but something older and more serious. The expression of a young man who had just seen something he would remember for a very long time. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. He rode back to the herd. She turned back to Cole. He was watching her. 2 days to Abilene, she said. 2 days, he agreed. She reached down and gave him her hand. He took it. He got to his feet carefully, the weight off the bad ankle, her shoulder solid under his arm, and together they walked back toward the camp, toward the fire she would build, toward the work that always came next, toward the 2 days that stood between this moment and the conversation that was waiting for them in Abilene, toward whatever came after that. She didn't know what it was. But she was no longer the woman who believed she didn't deserve to find out. That woman had stayed behind in Harlan Creek in the house with the keys on the table and the empty tin box and the wooden cross that the preacher had carved in under an hour. This woman was walking toward something. She didn't have a name for it yet. But she was walking. And that was enough. Abilene arrived the way the end of hard things usually did not, with fanfare, not with the dramatic relief Nora had half imagined during the worst days of the drive, but quietly, incrementally, the town appearing in the distance and growing larger as they moved toward it, until suddenly, they were simply there. The herd went into the stockyards without incident. The buyers were waiting. The paperwork moved efficiently through Cole's hands. He managed it on horseback, the bad ankle wrapped tight, and resting in the stirrup at an angle Hank had devised to keep the weight off it, moving slower than usual, but moving. He was not a man who stayed down. She had learned that about him. She was still learning things about him, which was itself something she hadn't expected to be doing this far into the drive. The cowboys got paid at the stockyard office. She watched them come out one by one, Billy with his wages folded carefully into his hatband, Roy with his hand already moving toward the vest pocket where he kept his son's photograph, old Pete counting his coins twice in the way of a man who had learned not to trust that good things were real on the first look. Darnell bought himself a new hat from the first shop he passed and wore it out of the store at an angle that made him look younger than he was. She stood at the chuck wagon and watched them scatter toward baths and beds and saloons and all the ordinary human comforts that 6 weeks of trail life made extraordinary, and she felt something she hadn't anticipated feeling. She was going to miss them. Not the work exactly, though she had found a satisfaction in it that surprised her. Not the hardship, but the particular texture of a group of people who had come to know each other in the compressed, honest way that hard shared circumstances produced. You couldn't perform yourself for 6 weeks in difficult country. Eventually, what was real came to the surface. What was real in these men had turned out to be better than she'd expected on that first morning at Miller's Crossing. Most people were up close. She was thinking about that when Cole appeared at the wagon. He was moving carefully, the ankle still tender, but his face was composed and his eyes were clear, and he had the look of a man who had completed what he set out to do and was now ready for the next thing. $40, he said, and held out the payment. She took it. She looked at it for a moment. 4 $10 bills, more money than she'd had at one time in the past 2 years. And she thought about the tin box with $4.60, and the table where she had sat staring at the wall. "Thank you," she said. "You earned it," he said. "And then some." She folded the bills and put them in her pocket. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You said in Abilene," she said. "I said in Abilene," he agreed. "Then let's find somewhere to have that conversation," she said. They found a quiet table at the back of a restaurant that was not the kind of establishment that required you to be presentable, which was fortunate given that neither of them was. The food was simple and hot, and she ate it with the appreciation of someone who had been cooking for others for 6 weeks and had not often been cooked for. Cole ordered coffee and then wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her across the table with that direct, quiet attention she had come to recognize as his particular way of approaching things that mattered. "I want to say something first," he said. "All right. I'm not going to tell you the ranch needs you," he said. "It does, but that's not the point. And I'm not going to tell you that you'd have a good life there, because I don't think that's something one person can promise another." He paused. "What I'm going to tell you is true, and it's simple, and it's this: I have not felt like the ranch was a home in 4 years. 4 days into this drive, I started feeling like it might be possible again, and that feeling is connected entirely to you." She was very still. "Gideon, let me finish," he said, not forcefully, just steadily. "I know you buried your husband 7 weeks ago. I know that's not enough time by any reasonable measure. I know I'm asking you to consider something large before you've had room to grieve properly, and I'm not comfortable with that. But I also know that you're standing at the end of a cattle drive with $40, and the kind of courage that most people spend their whole lives wishing they had, and I'm not willing to let you walk away from Abilene without telling you plainly that I don't want you to." The restaurant was quiet around them. Somewhere a door opened and closed. A woman laughed at another table. "I'm not asking you to decide today," he said. "I'm asking you to know." She sat with that for a moment. "I know," she said finally. "Yeah. Yes." She looked at him. "I've known for a while. That's not the hard part." "What's the hard part?" She thought about how to say it honestly. "The hard part," she said slowly, "is that I have spent my entire life being looked at a certain way, being categorized before I've opened my mouth, being considered a problem to manage rather than a person to know." She paused. "And I have learned, it took me a long time to learn this, not to let that become the story I tell about myself. But it's different to not let other people's story become yours and to actually believe you deserve something different. Those are two different things." He was listening with the fullness she'd come to rely on. "I'm working on the second one," she said. "I've been working on it for longer than I like to admit, and I'm not fully there yet." "I know that," he said. She blinked. "You do. I've been watching you for 6 weeks," he said. "I've watched you accept gratitude with about 1/10 of the ease you accept difficulty. I've watched you minimize your own role in things you were entirely responsible for. I've watched you flinch just slightly, just for a second, when someone compliments you like you're waiting for the catch." He kept his eyes on hers. "You don't do that when someone gives you a problem to solve. You go straight at it. But when someone tries to give you something good, you check the exits first." She stared at him. "That's very accurate," she said quietly. "I know what I see," he said, "and I want to be clear about something. I'm not asking you to come to the ranch because I feel sorry for you. I'm not asking because I need a cook. I'm asking because you are the most capable, the most honest, the most genuinely good person I have been in close proximity to since Catherine died. And I am not going to pretend that I don't know that, just because the timing is uncomfortable." Her throat was doing something inconvenient. "You're not uncomfortable with—" She stopped. She started again. "The way I look doesn't—" "Nora." He said her name the way he always said it. "I'm going to stop you there. Not because the question isn't reasonable, but because the honest answer is that the question itself tells me more about what other people have put in your head than it tells me about anything real." He leaned forward slightly. "I hired you because you stood in front of me and told me the truth about what you could do. I trust you because you have done what you said you'd do every single day in harder conditions than anyone expected. I'm sitting across from you in Abilene having this conversation because you are the person you are, and not one part of that is conditional on anything other than who you are." She pressed her lips together. She would not cry in this restaurant. She was making that a firm rule, effective immediately. "I need time," she said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. "You have it," he said. "I need to think." "Take what you need." "Gideon." "Yes." "I'm not saying no," she said. Something moved through his face like light through water there, and gone but real. "All right," he said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. They sat in the quiet restaurant and drank their coffee, and the world held still for a moment around them, which felt like a gift after 6 weeks of it, moving at a constant, demanding pace. The gift lasted until the next morning. She was at the hotel where Cole had arranged rooms for the drive crew when the knock came at her door before breakfast. She opened it, expecting Billy or Hank, and found instead a woman she had never seen 50 years old, sharply dressed with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something harder. "Mrs. Calloway," the woman said. Nora looked at her. "Yes. My name is Margaret Thorne. I am Reginald Hendricks's sister." She said it the way people said things they expected to have weight. "I'd like a word with you." Nora's first instinct was to close the door. Her second instinct was more interesting. She opened it wider. "Come in," she said. Margaret Thorne came in and looked around the room with the expression of someone performing a social concession and wanting it noted. She sat in the room's only chair without being offered it. "My brother intends to file suit against Gideon Cole," she said, "for what he characterizes as harassment and illegal passage through Hendricks land." The land agent Whitmore verified the route was legitimate, Nora said. The marshal's office confirmed it. "My brother is a resourceful man with considerable connections," Margaret said. "A legal challenge, even a losing one, could tie up Cole's assets for months, possibly a year." She paused. His ranch would have difficulty operating through that kind of uncertainty. Nora kept her face still. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because my brother is willing to drop the suit," Margaret said. "On a condition." "What condition?" "There is a man in this territory, a legitimate land agent, not Whitmore, who can redirect the territorial boundary filing that would shut down Hendricks' claim permanently. His name is Aldous Park. He's been refusing to meet with Reginald for 2 years. She looked at Nora with the directness of a woman who had learned to be direct in a world that hadn't rewarded it. "He won't meet with Reginald, but he might meet with you." Nora stared at her. "Why me?" "Because Aldous Park's wife was from Harlan Creek," Margaret said. "And she talked about a woman who had nursed her sister through fever 3 winters ago. A large woman with black hair and dark eyes who refused to take payment for it." She paused. "Are you that woman?" Nora thought back 3 winters. The Hadley family on the east end of town. Sarah Hadley's sister Marion, who had come to visit in December and taken sick within the week. "I remember Marion," she said carefully. "Marion Park is Aldous Park's wife," Margaret said. "She has told him about the woman who saved her." Margaret's expression was complicated. Not warm, not cold, but somewhere between them, like a woman doing something that cost her pride, and was doing it anyway. "My brother is not a good man, I know that. But he is my brother, and the suit he's threatening will destroy him as surely as it damages Cole when the full evidence of his fraud comes out in a public proceeding." She stopped. "I am trying to stop him from destroying himself." Nora absorbed that. "You want me to meet with Aldous Park," she said. "Get him to file the counterclaim that makes your brother's position legally untenable, which forces your brother to drop the suit because it becomes his only way to avoid prosecution himself." "Yes," Margaret said. "That saves Cole," Nora said slowly. "And it also saves Hendricks from himself." "I am not asking you to like it," Margaret said stiffly. "I'm asking you to do it." Nora looked at her for a long moment. There was something almost moving about Margaret Thorne, the rigidity of her, the pride that she was clearly paying a significant cost to set aside even temporarily the love for a brother that persisted despite full knowledge of who he was. Nora understood imperfect love. She had grown up with it. "Where is Aldous Park?" she said. She didn't tell Cole. She told herself it was because she didn't want him to stop her, or to insist on coming with her on a bad ankle, or to take over a negotiation that required her specifically. All of those things were true. But the deeper truth, which she admitted to herself on the walk across Abilene to the offices where Aldous Park was conducting his survey work, was that she needed to do this on her own. Not to prove something to Cole, to prove something to herself. Park was a slight man in his 50s with careful eyes and a bureaucrat's habit of keeping his face professionally neutral. He looked at her when she came in, and she watched his neutral face flicker once. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Park," she said. "I think you know why I'm here." "Marion told me about you," he said. "When I heard a Mrs. Calloway was traveling with Cole's Drive, He stopped. "Marion still talks about that December, what you did for her." "I did what needed doing," Nora said. "She almost didn't make it," he said quietly. "But she did." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She did." He looked at her with the directness of a man getting to the point. "You're here about the Hendricks filing." "I am." "It's fraudulent," he said. "I've known it for 3 months. But filing a counterclaim means a confrontation with Hendricks and his money and his legal team, and my office has—" He paused. Limited resources for that kind of fight. Hendrix's sister came to me this morning, Nora said. She wants him stopped. She'll cooperate with documentation proving the fraud if you file the counterclaim. That takes the legal burden off your office because the evidence comes from Hendrix's own family. She paused. It's not a fight anymore. It's a filing. Park looked at her. Margaret Thorne came to you, he said slowly. She did. She hates her brother's business practices, but she's protected him for 20 years out of family loyalty, Park said. What changed? He's about to file a suit that will expose the full scope of the fraud in a public proceeding, Nora said. She's trying to save him from himself. Park was quiet for a long moment. His hands moved to the papers on his desk, and then away again. If I file this, he said, it protects Cole's Drive legally and permanently. No more challenges, no more blocked routes. Yes, she said. And it helps Margaret Thorne's brother avoid prosecution by making the suit he's threatening inadvisable. Yes. And you're asking me to do this, he said, because of what you did for Marion on a December night 3 years ago. She looked at him directly. I'm asking you to do it because it's right, she said. What I did for Marion has nothing to do with it. I didn't nurse her so I could call in a debt later. I nursed her because she was sick and I could help. She paused. But if knowing who I am gives you more confidence that I'm telling you the truth about Margaret Thorne's cooperation, then yes, use it for that. Park looked at her for a very long time. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a pen. I'll need Margaret Thorne's signature on an affidavit by end of business today, he said. You'll have it, Nora said. She got it. It took 2 hours and a conversation with Margaret Thorne that was sharp-edged and uncomfortable, and ultimately on both sides honest. The kind of honesty that two women who had spent their lives being underestimated could produce when they stopped sizing each other up and started actually talking. Margaret signed. Nora brought the document back to Park's office before 3 o'clock. She walked back to the hotel, and she stood outside it for a moment on the board sidewalk with the afternoon sun on her face and Abilene moving around her, and $40 in her pocket, and the full weight of what she had just done, settling through her like water through soil, slow and real and permanent. She had done that. Not Cole. Not Hank. Not anyone who had authority or resources or a name that carried weight in the territory. Her. The widow from Harlan Creek that nobody had wanted. She had done that. She stood with it. She let herself have it. Then she went inside to find Cole. He was in the hotel's common room, with Hank going over paperwork from the sale, and he looked up when she came in and immediately read something in her face. What happened? He said. She sat down across from him, and she told him. All of it. Margaret Thorne at her door, Aldous Park, and his connection to Marion the affidavit, the counterfiling. She told it straight through without editorializing the way she'd learned to tell things from watching him do it. When she finished, Hank let out a slow breath and said, Well, Lord Almighty. Cole was looking at her. She looked back at him. You went alone, he said. Yes. You didn't tell me. No. Because you knew I'd want to come. Yes, she said. And because it needed to be me. Specifically me. He was quiet for a moment. Park knew you because of Marion, he said. Yes, but I didn't use that the way you might think. I asked him to file because it was right. I just needed him to trust that I was telling him the truth about Margaret's cooperation. And he did. He did. Cole leaned back. He looked at her with the full weight of that direct attention. Hendrix is finished, he said. The fraudulent claim, the blocked routes, the cut supplies, all of it's going to come out in the counterfiling. He can't sue me now without putting himself in front of a judge who already has Park's documentation. That's what Margaret was counting on, Nora said. She knows Reginald well enough to know he'll drop it rather than face the exposure. She used you, Hank said not unkindly. We used each other, Nora said. That's different. Hank looked at Cole. Cole looked at Hank. Something passed between them that she couldn't fully read, but recognized as masculine acknowledgement of something that didn't need to be said aloud. Cole stood up. The ankle was still wrapped, but he was moving better. The day's rest had helped. "Walk with me," he said to Nora. She stood. They went outside onto the sidewalk and walked slowly, because of the ankle, which suited her because she was not in a particular hurry. The late afternoon was cooling toward evening, and Abilene was settling into its end-of-day rhythms, the stockyard noise quieter, the saloon starting to fill horses tied in long, patient rows outside the storefronts. "I need to tell you something," Cole said. "All right. That conversation in the restaurant yesterday," he said. "I said what I meant. I meant what I said. That hasn't changed." He paused. "But what you did today changes something." She glanced at him. "What does it change?" "Not what I feel," he said carefully. "What I understand." He was quiet for a moment, finding the words with his usual deliberateness. "I knew you were capable. I'd watched you for 6 weeks. I knew you were brave and smart and honest. But today—" He stopped. "Today I understood that you are someone who will walk into a situation I couldn't have handled myself and come back with exactly what we needed. Not because someone told you to, not because it was in your duties, because you saw it needed doing. I'm not sure that's Nora, her name, that weight." "Stop!" She stopped. "I said yesterday that I didn't want you to walk away from Abilene without knowing I didn't want you to," he said. "What I should have also said is this. I need you to understand that I am not asking you to come to the ranch because I want to take care of you. I am asking you because I want to build something with you. Something that requires 2 people who are actually equal partners in it. And you are the first person since Catherine who has made me believe that's possible." She was stopped on the sidewalk. People moved around them. "Equal partners," she said. "Equal partners," he said. She thought about James, who had loved her with warmth and simplicity, and without the complexity that time and loss and survival added to people. She thought about who she had been with James, young and soft and not yet tested. She was not that woman anymore. She thought about who she was now, a woman who found water in dry country, who fed 30 men on almost nothing, who walked through a herd of panicked cattle to reach a man who was down, who sat across from Margaret Thorne and Aldous Park and got what she went for. She thought about a ranch east of Harlan Creek, and a man with gray at his temples and a jaw cut from creekstone, who looked at her like she was worth looking at. "I have conditions," she said. His eyebrow moved. "Tell me." "I'm not going as your housekeeper," she said. "I'm not going as your cook. If I'm going as your partner. That means I have a voice in decisions. That means when I see something that needs doing, I do it without having to ask permission. That means if I disagree with you, I say so." "Those aren't conditions," he said. "Those are expectations. I have the same ones." "And I need time," she said. "Before anything formal, I need time to—" She thought about the right way to say it. "I need to grieve properly. I love James. I lost him 11 days before I met you, and I haven't had room to feel that the way it deserves to be felt. I'm not going to start something new on top of something unfinished." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I waited 4 years after Catherine. I'm not in a hurry. I'm asking you to come to the ranch, to work with me, to let whatever comes next come at its own pace." "You'd wait," she said. "Yes." "For how long?" He looked at her directly. "As long as it takes." Not a performance of patience, just a man who meant what he said. She looked at him. She thought about the board sidewalk outside the house in Harlan Creek, and the keys on the table, and Cecil Pruitt's thumbs in his suspenders. She thought about the first morning at Miller's Crossing, and the voices that said, "fat and slow and liability." She thought about Billy's face when he said you went through the herd. She thought about what it felt like to stand in the sun outside Aldous Park's office, and understand truly and fully that she had done that. Her. "Yes," she said. Cole went still. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'll come to the ranch. We'll work together. And whatever comes next." She looked at him. "We'll let it come." Something happened in his face, slow and deep and real, the way things happened in him without performance, without theater. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood on the sidewalk while Abilene moved around them, ordinary and alive and indifferent to the fact that two people who had both lost everything had just decided to try again. Then Billy appeared from around the corner, hat pushed back on his head, face bright with some piece of news he was clearly bursting to deliver. "Mrs. Nora," he said. "You hear about Hendricks?" "What about him?" she said. "Word just came through he withdrew the suit, just like that. His lawyer filed a dismissal an hour ago." Billy's eyes were wide. "Folks are saying the whole land claim was a fraud, and now the marshal is looking into it." He looked between her and Cole. "Did you know about this?" Cole glanced at Nora. Nora said, "Mr. Cole handled it." Cole looked at her. She looked back at him straight-faced. His mouth moved at the corner. "Something like that?" he said to Billy. Billy accepted this and moved on to deliver his news to someone else, and Cole turned to look at Nora with an expression she hadn't seen before. Something warm and startled and genuinely amused. "Mr. Cole handled it," he repeated. "You did handle some of it," she said. "I sat in a restaurant and drank coffee." "You handled the restaurant," she said, very competently. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before. Not really, not the full version of it, unguarded and real. It was a good sound, low and brief and genuine, like everything else about him. "Nora Calloway," he said, and there was something in his voice that was different now, lighter, like a door that had been opened in a room that had been closed for too long. "Gideon Cole," she said. They walked back toward the hotel in the evening light. Equal partners, not rushed, not certain of everything, not without grief or difficulty, or the long, patient work of becoming something real. But walking. Together. And that after everything was more than either of them had believed they'd ever have again. The ride back to Harlan Creek took 4 days. Cole had arranged a wagon, not the chuck wagon, which stayed in Abilene with Hank to be restocked for the return trip, but a lighter rig, easier on the ankle, easier on the road. He drove. She sat beside him. There was no particular reason she needed to sit beside him, rather than in the back, and neither of them mentioned this. Billy rode with them as far as the junction where his road split south toward Texas. He pulled his horse up and looked at them both from under his new hat. He'd spent part of his wages on it in Abilene, a proper one this time, not the battered thing he'd worn through 6 weeks of cattle country. "Mrs. Nora," he said. "Billy," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his saddle horn, the way young men looked at things when they were trying to decide whether to say what they actually meant. "I never told you," he said. "That first night, when you wrapped my hand. Nobody on any drive I've ever worked asked my name before they did something for me." He looked up. "I just wanted you to know I remembered that." She kept her face composed. "You ride safe," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He tipped his hat to Cole. "Boss." Then he turned his horse south and rode without looking back the way young men rode when they were afraid that looking back would cost them something. She watched him go until the road bent and took him out of sight. Then she was quiet for a while, and Cole let her be quiet, and the wagon moved northeast through country that was opening up into something greener and more settled as they left the hard summer range behind. "He'll be all right," Cole said eventually. "I know," she said. "He's tougher than he looks." "Most people are." "Yes," she said. "They are." She had been thinking about that a great deal, about the compressed, accelerated way you came to know people in hard circumstances, how 6 weeks on a cattle drive with 30 strangers had shown her more of what people were made of than 6 years in Harlan Creek had managed. Roy with his photograph. Darnell with his borrowed swagger that covered something more uncertain. Old Pete counting his coins twice. Hank, who was loyal and competent and entirely without drama in a way she had come to regard as one of the more underrated human qualities. And Cole, who had hired her when nobody else would, and meant what he said, and sat at her fire every night, and trusted her judgment in the way that very few people ever had. She was going to his ranch. She was still absorbing that. Not with anxiety, she had made the decision clearly, and she stood by it, but with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that were real and large and irreversible. She wanted to feel the full weight of it. She had learned not to rush past important things because rushed past important things had a way of coming back later with interest. She was going to his ranch. She was going to learn who Gideon Cole was in ordinary life, in the daily undramatic hours that a cattle drive compressed and distorted. She was going to find out what he was like on a Tuesday morning, with no crisis to manage what his patience looked like when it wasn't being tested. What made him laugh, the way he'd laughed on that sidewalk in Abilene, briefly, fully real. She was going to find out what she was like there too. That was the part she was quieter about. They stopped the first night at a way station where a family named Gruber ran a modest operation. A meal and a place to sleep in exchange for a fair price. Mrs. Gruber was a stout woman in her 60s with efficient hands and kind eyes, who took one look at Nora and immediately told her to sit down. "You look like you've been working too hard," Mrs. Gruber said, setting a plate in front of her with the authority of a woman who did not offer this as a suggestion. Nora looked at the plate. Then she looked up at Mrs. Gruber. "I've been cooking for 30 men for 6 weeks," she said. "Then somebody else can cook tonight," Mrs. Gruber said firmly. "Eat." Nora ate. It was the best meal she'd had in 6 weeks. Not because it was exceptional, but because someone else had made it, and all she had to do was receive it. She sat at that table and ate every bite and did not think about quantities or rationing or how to stretch the beans another day, and it was a profound relief in a way she hadn't anticipated. Cole watched her across the table with an expression she was coming to read more fluently. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. But the corner of his mouth was doing the thing. "Say it," she said. "You look surprised," he said. "That someone's feeding you." "I'm not surprised," she said. "I'm just—" She stopped. I forgot what it felt like, being on the receiving end. He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to have to get used to that," he said. She looked at him. "On the ranch," he said. "I cook. I'm not good at it, but I cook. And you are not going to cook every meal just because you're better at it than I am." "That seems inefficient," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But it's how it's going to be." She wanted to argue. She recognized that impulse, the deeply ingrained reflex to make herself useful to justify her presence through production to earn the space she occupied. She put her fork down. "All right," she said. He nodded once satisfied. Mrs. Gruber brought pie. Nora ate 2 pieces and did not apologize for either of them. The second day they talked, not about anything consequential, which was itself consequential. They had spent 6 weeks talking about problems and solutions and the next necessary thing, and this was different, the slower, more meandering conversation of 2 people learning each other in the absence of crisis. She found out that he had 3 dogs on the ranch, all named after cattle drive trails in a fit of geographical naming that he acknowledged was not particularly original. She found out that he actually read, not just ledgers and legal documents, but books, history mostly, and occasionally poetry, which surprised her enough that she turned to look at him directly. "Poetry," she said. "Don't make something of it," he said. "I'm not making something of it," she said. "I'm just—" She thought about it. "Catherine. She read it to me," he said. "And then I started reading it myself after she was gone. It felt like—" He paused. "Like keeping something of hers alive." She understood that completely. "James sang," she said. "Badly, loudly. He didn't know he was bad, and I never told him." She looked at the road ahead. "I missed the singing more than I expected. The house was very quiet." "The ranch is quiet," Cole said. "I should tell you that. It's not a social place." "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who mostly pretended I wasn't there," she said. "Quiet doesn't frighten me." "Some people find it hard," he said, after a while. "Do you—" He thought about it honestly. "The first year after Catherine, yes. Now—" He considered. "Now it's just the sound of the place. The cattle, the dogs. Wind. He glanced at her. It'll be different with another person there. Different good or different complicated? She asked. Both probably, he said. In my experience, those two things travel together. In mine too, she said. They drove in comfortable silence for a while after that. She thought about quiet ranches and 3 dogs named after trails and a man who read poetry to keep something of his dead wife alive. And she thought about herself, large and capable, and still learning to believe she deserved to take up the space she naturally occupied. And she thought that different complicated and different good were in fact almost always the same thing. She had said that to him once about strength and stubbornness. It kept turning out to be true in new configurations. On the 3rd night, the twist she hadn't seen coming found them. They had stopped in a small town called Morrow's Gap, barely large enough to qualify as a town, a general store, a livery, a boarding house. Cole had gone to see about the horses while Nora arranged their rooms, and she was coming back down the boarding house stairs when she heard the voice in the common room below. She stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom. She knew that voice. She had not heard it in 7 weeks, but she would have known it across a crowded street in a rainstorm. Cecil Pruitt. He was sitting at a table with 2 other men she didn't recognize, talking in the loud, expansive way of a man who had had enough whiskey to feel important. He hadn't seen her. She was still on the stairs, partially shadowed. Her first instinct was to go back up. She stayed on the step. She listened. Woman walked out of Harlan Creek with nothing, Pruitt was saying. Just gone. Never paid me the last 2 weeks. He shook his head. Fat widow Calloway. Thought she was something special, that one. Her husband dies and she just walks off. One of the other men said something she didn't catch. Cattle drive, Pruitt said with the tone of someone conveying the punchline of a joke. Hired on as a cook, they said. 30 cowboys and a fat widow woman. He laughed and the other men laughed, and the sound of it sat in her chest, the way that particular kind of laughter always had, not painful exactly, not anymore, but present, a reminder of what she had come from. She came down the last 3 stairs. She walked into the common room. Pruitt saw her. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, discomfort, and then, because he was constitutionally incapable of backing down in front of an audience, a performative recovery that settled into something between bluster and dismissal. Mrs. Calloway, he said. Mr. Pruitt, she said. The 2 other men had gone quiet. Heard you been on a cattle drive, Pruitt said. I have, she said. Well? He looked at her with the practiced eye of a man assessing real estate. You look... He paused. He was looking for the diminishment and not finding the usual purchase for it. Tired, he finished, which was not what he'd started to say. I've been working, she said. 6 weeks. Sure, he said. Sure. She looked at him. She had rehearsed versions of this moment in the abstract in the back of her mind, in the small hours of the drive, when sleep didn't come easily. She had imagined what she might say to Cecil Pruitt if she ever saw him again. She had composed speeches in her head, precise and devastating, that said every true thing she had never said. She didn't say any of them. You're owed 2 weeks' rent, she said, from the house on Birch Street. He blinked. She reached into her pocket and took out her wages, the $40, and she counted out the amount she owed him, and she set it on the table in front of him. We're settled, she said. Pruitt looked at the money. He looked at her. Mrs. Calloway, he started. Good evening, Mr. Pruitt, she said. She walked out of the common room. She walked out the front door of the boarding house and stood on the step in the night air and let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the particular adrenaline of doing something exactly right, of finding the action that was true to who she was, rather than who she was angry about being pushed into being. She had paid him. Not because she owed him anything beyond the money, but because she was not going to leave that debt between them. She was not going to carry Cecil Pruitt on her back into the rest of her life. She heard boots on the boards behind her. Cole's hands came down on her shoulders, light, steady, asking nothing. I saw him in there, Cole said. Yes, she said. Are you? I'm fine, she said. I paid him what I owed him. A pause. You didn't owe him anything except the rent, Cole said carefully. That's what I paid him, she said. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, I was watching from the doorway. I would have... I know, she said. That's why I didn't wait for you. His hands on her shoulders didn't move. She could feel the warmth of them through the fabric of her dress. You didn't need me to, he said. Not a question. No, she said. But it means something that you were in the doorway. A long pause. Yes, he said quietly. I reckon it does. She turned around. He was looking at her with that open, steady expression, the one she had first seen on the step outside Whitmore's room in Caldwell Station, the one that had been slowly becoming the expression she associated most directly with him. I want to go home, she said. And she meant it in the full, complicated, weighted sense of the word, not back to Harlan Creek, not to any specific building or address, but toward something she was learning to believe she was allowed to want. Then let's go home, he said. They arrived at Cole's ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late August. It was nothing like what she'd imagined and exactly what she'd expected, which was a contradiction that somehow made perfect sense. The main house was solid and plain, and had the particular character of a place that had been well built and then lived in without much decoration, functional, clean, honest. The three dogs, whom Cole introduced without self-consciousness as Chisholm Goodnight, and Shawnee came off the porch at a full run, and demonstrated immediately that whatever other qualities they possessed, dignity was not among them. Shawnee, the youngest and most undignified of the three, went directly to Nora and put both front paws on her skirt, and looked up at her with the expression of an animal that had decided something without consulting anyone. She doesn't do that with strangers, Cole said. I'm not a stranger, Nora said, and scratched Shawnee's ears. Hank had returned 2 days ahead of them and had seen to the immediate ranch business, which meant that Cole's first afternoon back was quieter than usual. He showed her the house, not with the nervousness of a man seeking approval, but with the straightforward practicality of someone orienting a new partner to a shared workspace. She noticed everything. The kitchen that was functional, but had clearly been used minimally. The shelf of books in the main room, more than she'd expected, organized in a way that suggested they were actually read rather than displayed. The photograph on the mantel that she looked at carefully when Cole stepped out to speak with Hank. Catherine, dark-haired, laughing at whoever was holding the camera, which had probably been Cole. She had a face that suggested the warmth and humor he had described, lively, open, thoroughly present. Nora looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't jealous. She had understood since that first evening at the fire, when Cole had talked about Catherine's laughter, that she wasn't replacing anyone. She wasn't meant to be Catherine. Cole didn't want her to be. He had said it plainly, two people building something new, not one person filling another's absence. She would have liked you, Cole said from the doorway. She turned. He was leaning against the doorframe, looking at the photograph. You can't know that, she said. I knew her for 9 years, he said. I know exactly the kind of person she liked. He looked at Nora. She had no patience for performance. She liked people who did what they said and meant what they did. He paused. You qualify. Nora looked back at the photograph. I'll try not to disappoint her then, she said. She'd say that's not how it works, Cole said. She'd say you just have to be who you are. She sounds like she was wise. She was, he said, and stubborn. You would have argued. About what? Everything, he said. And then agreed on most of it. She smiled. Genuinely, fully the kind of smile she had given infrequently enough in her life that it still felt like a small event when it happened. He saw it. He looked at her like he was filing it away. The first weeks at the ranch established themselves in a rhythm that surprised her with its rightness. She was not the cook. She had agreed to that in the wagon, and she held to it, which meant that Cole's limited culinary skills produced some genuinely unfortunate meals that she ate without comment, because a deal was a deal. She was the person who managed the ranch's supply ordering, who renegotiated 2 supplier contracts that Cole had been overpaying on for years, who reorganized the storage situation in the barn with the same focused efficiency she had brought to the chuck wagon. She found water in 2 places on the property that Cole hadn't known about. The first time he looked at the ground where she'd indicated, and then at her, and then at the ground again. "My father's geology lessons," she said. "I'm starting to think your father was the most accidentally useful man who ever lived," Cole said. "Don't give him too much credit," she said. "He still left." No, Cole said. "But he left you with something that found us water twice. I'm choosing to be grateful for that part." She looked at him. "That's generous," she said. "I'm a generous man," he said straight-faced. She had not expected him to have that quality, the dry, understated humor that appeared infrequently, but consistently always at the moment she least expected it. It delighted her every time. She suspected he knew this and deployed it accordingly. The ranch hands were a different matter. There were 4 of them permanent crew, not seasonal, and they ranged from guardedly polite to openly uncertain about her presence. She had navigated this before. She did not force anything. She did her work visibly and competently, and she learned their names and their particulars, the way she had learned the drive crews, through observation, through small attentions, through the patient accumulation of being consistently, reliably present. The turning point was a man named Ortega. Ortega was the eldest of the 4 hands, somewhere in his late 50s, with a quiet authority the others looked to without quite acknowledging they were doing it. He had been polite but watchful in her first 2 weeks at the ranch, and she had felt his assessment without letting herself be pressured by it. On a Wednesday, 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, she was near the south fence, checking the repair work that had been done on a section that had come down in the summer storm, when she heard a sound from the far side of the fence that she identified immediately as wrong. She went through the fence without hesitating. The calf was in a ditch, not badly hurt, but badly frightened. One leg caught in old fencing wire that had been there long enough to become invisible in the grass. It was small enough and frightened enough to be a significant hazard to itself. The more it struggled, the worse the wire would bite. She talked to it first, low and steady, the same way she talked to frightened horses. She kept her body movements slow and deliberate. The calf went still, not calm, but still, which was enough. She worked the wire free with her hands, taking her time staying quiet, ignoring the way the wire bit into her own palms. The calf bolted the moment it was free. She sat back on her heels and looked at her hands. "Been watching you for 10 minutes, Ortega said from behind her. She hadn't heard him come up. She turned. He was looking at her hands, then at the wire, then at her. "Most people would have called for help," he said. "Calf was frightened enough already," she said. "More people would have made it worse." He was quiet for a moment. "That's right," he said. He reached down and offered her a hand up. She took it. After that, Ortega was not guardedly polite. He was simply respectful in the clean, unambiguous way that respect actually looked when it wasn't being performed. The other hands followed his lead within a week, the way people followed Ortega's lead in general, not because he told them to, but because he was the kind of man whose judgment they had learned to trust. She understood that dynamic entirely. The grief came in October. Not suddenly, it had been present all along in the background of everything, folded into the texture of each day, the way sorrow folded into the texture of people who had experienced it and kept moving. But in October, it came forward, and she let it. She had known it was waiting. She had known since Abilene, since the moment she'd said yes, that she was going to need to stop moving long enough to feel what she had been carrying since that Friday when James went into the ground behind the Methodist church. It came on a Sunday morning when the light was the particular October gold that came through clean, cold air, and she was alone in the house. Cole was out with Ortega on the South Range, and she sat at the kitchen table and thought about James. She let herself think about all of him. Not just the clean, summarized version she had been carrying through 6 weeks of a cattle drive and 4 weeks of a new life. The full version. James at 23 with his loud, terrible singing that she had never corrected. James in the kitchen of the little house making coffee badly and handing it to her with the pride of a man who believed he had done something excellent. James who had never once made her feel like her body was an inconvenience or a failing, who had put his arms around her with a completeness and lack of self-consciousness that she had not fully understood was rare until she had lived without it. She cried for a long time. The 3 dogs were in the house. Cole had gradually stopped arguing about this, and Shawnee put her head in Nora's lap and stayed there, which was the correct response, because sometimes there was nothing to be done except stay. She cried until she was empty. Then she sat in the quiet kitchen and breathed. She heard the door. She heard Cole's boots stop when he came in and took in the room, and she turned to look at him with her face still wet and made no move to hide it. He looked at her. He didn't say anything about giving her space. He didn't ask if she was all right with the particular careful delicacy of a man trying not to get this wrong. He sat down across from her at the table, just sat present and unhurried the way he was present with everything. And he looked at her and let her be exactly where she was. "James," she said, not a question. "James," she said again. He nodded. "He deserved better than 4 days," she said. He was 23 years old. He deserved to get old and annoying and to be difficult about things that didn't matter. She pressed her fingers against her eyes briefly. "He would have been so annoying at 50. I would have loved it." Cole was quiet. Then he said, "Tell me about him." She looked at him. "Tell me who he was," Cole said. "Not the summary. Who he was." She told him. She told him about the singing and the bad coffee, and the way James had always been the first person in any room to laugh at a joke and the last person to leave a conversation, because he was genuinely interested in everyone he met and never quite got around to wrapping things up. She told him about the morning James had proposed, which had involved dropping the ring and then both of them on their hands and knees looking for it for 20 minutes, and how James had been laughing so hard by the time they found it that the actual proposal had been barely coherent. She told him about the last night before the fever climbed too high when James had squeezed her hand and said, "You're going to be all right, Nora," which had infuriated her at the time because she didn't want to hear about all right. She wanted him to get well. And how she had understood later that he had meant it as a gift, that he was trying to give her something to carry. She had carried it. She was still carrying it. Cole listened to all of it. He didn't offer parallel stories, or redirect toward comfort, or make any of the small interventions people made when they were uncomfortable with another person's grief. He just listened fully, the way he did everything. When she was done, she felt hollowed out in the good way, the way you felt after you had finally put something down that you had been carrying in the wrong position for too long. "He sounds like a man who deserved to be loved," Cole said. "He was," she said. "He was a good man." "Yes," Cole said. "I think so too." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "I'm going to love you differently than I loved him," she said. It came out direct and plain, the way she said important things now. "Not better or worse, just differently. Because I'm different than I was, and because you're different than he was." She paused. "I need you to know that I'm not going to love you as a replacement for anything. I'm going to love you as the thing that you are." Cole was very still. "Is that—" she started. "Yes," he said. His voice was low and a little rough in a way it usually wasn't. "That is exactly what I need." She reached across the table. He took her hand. They sat like that for a long time at the kitchen table, in the October light. Two people who had each lost the first version of their lives and were sitting carefully and honestly in the beginning of the second. He asked her properly in November. Not with theater, not with performance. They were mending fence on the east pasture she had started joining him on the ranch work 2 weeks in, because the supply management only took so many hours, and she was not a woman built for inactivity. And he stopped working and straightened up and looked at her in the clean November cold. "Nora," he said. She looked up from the fencing wire. His face was open in the way she had first seen it on the step outside Whitmore's room, but clearer now, more settled, the face of a man who had decided something thoroughly and was at peace with it. "I would like to marry you," he said. "When you're ready. And only when you're ready. But I want you to know that's what I'm asking for." She looked at him. The east pasture stretched out around them, the November grass gone tawny and cold, the cattle moving slow in the distance. Shawnee was somewhere behind her investigating a fence post with excessive dedication. "I'm ready," she said. He blinked. "You've had 3 months," he said. "I've had 35 years," she said. "And 6 weeks on a cattle drive, and 4 months on your ranch." She looked at him directly. "I know what I know." "Nora, Gideon." She said his name the way he said hers, with the weight it deserved. "I spent my whole life being told I needed to wait. Wait until someone chose me. Wait until I was smaller or quieter or less of whatever I was too much of. Wait until the world decided I was worth something." She held his gaze. "I'm not waiting anymore. Not for the things I know are real." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass. Then he crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands, careful and deliberate, the way he did everything, and he looked at her like she was something he intended to see clearly for a very long time. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. They married in December. Small. Practical. The kind of ceremony that suited two people who had already learned that what mattered was what came after. Ortega stood with Cole. Billy, who had been notified by letter and had ridden 3 days to be there, stood beside Nora and cried openly and without embarrassment, which made Roy, who had also come with a photograph of Thomas, who was now walking apparently, and had opinions about everything, cry too, though he would have denied it afterward. The Reverend said the words. Cole said his plainly without flourish in the voice she had come to trust most in the world. She said hers the same way. When it was done, when the Reverend closed his book and the witnesses signed their names, Cole looked at her with that steady full attention and said very quietly, just for her, "I was standing at that corral thinking I was hiring a cook." "You were," she said. "I had no idea," he said. "No," she agreed. "Neither did I." Outside, Chisholm and Goodnight and Shawnee were creating havoc of some kind that Ortega was attempting to address with limited success. Roy was showing Thomas's photograph to anyone who held still long enough. Billy was already talking about next summer, and whether there'd be another drive, and whether Mrs. Cole, he corrected himself grinning, would consider coming back as cook. She heard all of it through the open door. She thought about Miller's Crossing, and the voice that had said fat and slow and liability. She thought about the table with the keys. She thought about standing outside Aldous Park's office in the Abilene sun, understanding what she had done. She thought about October in the kitchen, and grief finally given its full space, and a man who had sat with her in it without flinching. She thought about 35 years of being told in 100 different ways by 100 different people that she was too much in the ways that didn't count, and not enough in the ways that did. She looked at Gideon Cole, her husband. This plain, honest, complicated, deeply decent man who had looked at her across a dusty corral and asked, "Can you work?" and meant it as the only question that mattered. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that James told me I was going to be all right." Cole waited. "He was right," she said, "but I don't think he knew how much better than all right it was going to get." Something moved through his face, slow and deep and real. He took her hand. She held it. Outside, Shawnee had apparently escaped whatever Ortega was attempting, and came through the door at a full run, skidded on the wooden floor, and crashed into both of them with complete lack of regret. Cole said something under his breath. Nora laughed. Full and genuine, the kind of laughter that came from a place in her that had been quiet for a long time and was not quiet anymore. Gideon Cole looked at his wife laughing and looked like a man who had found the thing he hadn't known how to look for. And outside the December sky over Montana was the particular deep blue that came before the first snow, enormous and clean, and full of the specific impartial beauty of a world that did not concern itself with whether you deserved good things, but gave them anyway to those who had survived long enough to be standing in the right place at the right moment to receive them. She had survived. She was standing. She was exactly where